In 1984, the heavy metal band Iron Maiden released a 13-minute progressive rock track that directly quoted a 200-year-old poem. That same text birthed an idiom still used today. When a politician or an executive is weighed down by a past mistake, we say they have an albatross around their neck. Today, Samuel Taylor Coleridge's The Rime of the Ancient Mariner is a monument of English literature. But in 1798, its debut was a critical and commercial disaster. Contemporary reviewers dismissed the plot as a disjointed, incomprehensible mess. Prominent critics called the supernatural imagery bizarre, labeling the entire piece a Dutch attempt at the sublime. The most damaging sabotage didn't come from the press, it came from the book's own co-author, William Wordsworth, who actively marginalized the poem in subsequent editions to protect his own reputation. The poem survived specifically because its archaic form and deep allegorical architecture were deliberate acts of rebellion against the era's literary standards. Understanding its survival requires deconstructing it as a deliberate technological mechanism of psychological surrealism. The concept was born in November 1797 during a walking tour through the Quantock Hills in Somerset. Coleridge and Wordsworth needed to fund their travel expenses, so they planned to write a poem together. Wordsworth provided two initial structural prompts. He suggested using dead men to navigate a spectral ghost ship, and, pulling from old maritime travelogues, he pitched the idea of a sailor shooting an albatross. But their writing styles immediately clashed. Wordsworth preferred pastoral realism, while Coleridge leaned heavily into the Gothic. Wordsworth stepped back, leaving Coleridge to compose the epic entirely on his own. Coleridge built his narrative on a highly specific mechanical structure. The poem is definitively not free verse. As this diagram illustrates, he used the traditional ballad stanza. It is a 4-line quatrain that alternates in meter. The first and third lines use iambic tetrameter, 4 beats, while the second and fourth lines use iambic trimeter, dropping to 3 beats. This alternating rhythm locks into a strict ABCB rhyme scheme, giving the language an incantoric musical cadence. As we can see in this comparison, this structure stood in direct opposition to the late 18th century. Neoclassicism favored the rigid, hyper-polished heroic couplet, uniform lines marching in perfect pairs. In 1798, the folk ballad was considered an archaic, low-class format. It was the vernacular of street broadsides in oral folklore, not serious literature. Coleridge recognized the power of this rhythm. He would rely on it again in his later unfinished Gothic masterpiece, Christabel. Choosing the ballad stanza was a deliberate stylistic rebellion designed to weaponize an old working-class rhythm for highly intellectual terror. The plot built on top of this meter functions as a strict spiritual allegory. It illustrates Coleridge's philosophy of the one life, the belief that all living things are unified in a single divine network. The architecture of this allegory unfolds in 4 distinct phases. It begins with the sin. The mariner mindlessly shoots a friendly albatross that had been guiding the ship. It is an act of unprovoked nihilism, destroying a creature that represents the unity of God's creation. By killing the bird, the mariner attempts to assert mundane human control over the natural world. He reduces a sublime, mysterious creature into a dead object. This violation triggers the second phase, purgatory and divine retribution. The ship is pushed into the doldrums. The wind dies completely, and the crew is trapped in a terrifying stillness, physically isolated and spiritually cut off from the divine. As the mariner famously notes, "Water, water, everywhere, nor any drop to drink." The crew begins to die of thirst while floating on an endless ocean. Then a spectral ghost ship approaches. On board, 2 figures, Death and Life and Death, throw dice for the souls of the crew, plunging the narrative into pure Gothic dread. This suffering illustrates the romantic sublime. Nature is an uncontrollable force that actively punishes human hubris. The third phase of the allegory is grace and redemption. The emotional pivot occurs when the mariner looks into the dark water and sees monstrous sea snakes. Instead of feeling disgust, he recognizes their beauty and, as he states, blesses them unaware. In that exact moment of appreciating nature, the curse begins to break. The dead albatross, which the crew had hung around his neck as a mark of guilt, slides off and sinks into the sea. But salvation does not mean total freedom. The poem moves into its final phase, the penance. The mariner's absolute redemption is deferred. He is cursed with a psychological compulsion to wander the earth forever, identifying specific strangers who need to hear his tale. He is forced to repeat his moral lesson. He prayeth best who loveth best, all things both great and small. This rigid four-part structure strips away the protagonist's worldly ambition, forcing him into a state of profound vulnerability and permanent reverence for the natural world. When the collection Lyrical Ballads was published anonymously in 1798, The Ancient Mariner was the opening piece. The critical response was heavily negative. Reviewers were frustrated by the bizarre supernatural elements and the deliberate use of confusing pseudo-Chaucerian spellings. William Wordsworth grew intensely anxious. He believed his collaborators' surreal epic was dragging down the book's critical reception and commercial sales. As shown in this table of contents comparison, Wordsworth physically marginalized the poem for the 1800 second edition. He stripped it of its prestigious opening slot and relegated it to the very back of the book. He pressured Coleridge to modernize the spelling and inserted a blunt explanatory note in the preface, publicly listing what he viewed as the poem's defects. Rather than abandon the work, Coleridge spent the next 2 decades obsessively revising it. He aimed to appease the critics while clarifying the text's philosophical depth. This process culminated in the 1817 Sibylline Leaves edition. This layout reveals his defining revision, the marginal gloss. He added a running prose commentary alongside the poetry. Written in the persona of an antiquarian scholar, this text interpreted the old tale for the reader. This marginal gloss elevated the poem from a confusing supernatural tale into a framed ancient myth, making its transitions legible and its depth undeniable to a modern audience. Which leaves a historical question. Was Wordsworth wrong to marginalize the text? Historically and culturally, yes. He completely misjudged the poem's staying power. Wordsworth's focus on pastoral realism was a major literary advancement, but it had distinct limitations. Coleridge's deep dive into psychological surrealism exposed a profound vulnerability in the human condition. It accessed fears and theological anxieties that strict realism simply could not reach. That maritime dread continues to resonate. It has inspired definitive engravings by Gustave Doré, heavy metal anthems, and modern psychological cinema. The poem dominates the cultural landscape today, precisely because it successfully fused an archaic, haunting folk rhythm with terrifying theological allegory. Samuel Taylor Coleridge's The Rime of the Ancient Mariner stands as the defining psychological monument of British Romanticism, an artifact shaped by critical rejection, internal rivalry, and obsessive, brilliant revision.